You don't lose $2.7 billion the way you lose your keys. You lose it the way a system quietly moves it, signs it, approves it, and then pretends it never existed until one man who actually ran disaster response walks into a hearing room and asks a question no one in power was prepared to answer. What happens when the person asking that question isn't guessing, but knows exactly where the bodies are buried in the paperwork? This is not a normal congressional hearing. This is a controlled demolition of a narrative that was supposed to hold. House Oversight Committee Room, 254, Wednesday morning, 11:23 a.m. Eastern, the kind of setting that usually produces safe questions, rehearsed answers, and forgettable headlines. The kind of room where officials like Stephen Miller arrive expecting to explain policy, not defend the disappearance of billions. Jared Moskowitz did not come for policy. He came with a timeline, a number, and a gap that should not exist under any functioning system. For the first 40 minutes, everything looked routine, almost painfully routine. Members cycling through questions about emergency preparedness, interagency coordination, response timelines, the usual bureaucratic choreography that allows everyone to leave the room untouched. Stephen Miller played his role perfectly. Calm tone, controlled posture, citing frameworks, referencing procedures, answering just enough to sound competent without ever stepping into danger. And then the frame broke. Moskowitz leaned forward and said, "Let's talk about hurricanes." Not a topic shift, a trigger. Because what followed was not a question, it was an audit spoken out loud. He didn't speculate, he didn't accuse, he presented. A FEMA Office of Inspector General report, completed 6 weeks earlier, sealed until just days before the hearing, now sitting in plain sight, 47 pages that didn't just suggest irregularities, they mapped them. And right at the center of that map sat a single number, $2.7 billion. Authorized, approved, released. But never seen again by the people it was meant to help. No hurricane victims receiving it. No wildfire survivors touching it. No deployment logs matching it. Nothing. So Moskowitz did something rare in that room. He simplified the system to its most dangerous form. Money in, money out. Where did it go? And that's where the tension shifted from procedural to prosecutorial. Because this wasn't just about missing funds. It was about timing that didn't make sense, authorizations that came too early, allocations that didn't match real-world damage assessments, and a federal official who, for the first time that morning, no longer looked like he was in control of the narrative. But here's what matters more than the question itself. It's what Stephen Miller did next. Or more precisely, what he didn't do. Because in a system built entirely on answers, accountability, and documentation, silence is not neutral. Silence is a signal. And what unfolded after that question wasn't just hesitation, it was a crack in the structure. The first visible moment where the story being told could no longer support the weight of the evidence sitting right in front of it. So the real question isn't just where the $2.7 billion went. The real question is this: what kind of system produces a moment where a federal official, under oath, chooses silence over explanation when confronted with numbers that are supposed to be traceable down to the last dollar? Because once that silence entered the room, everything that came before it, every polished answer, every reference to procedure, every carefully measured sentence, started to collapse under a much simpler standard. Traceability. Jared Moskowitz didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He did something far more dangerous. He started stacking numbers. September 3rd. Emergency authorization signed. $2.7 billion released from the FEMA Disaster Relief Fund, officially designated for Hurricane Helene response and Western wildfire operations. On paper, that sounds like urgency. In practice, it raises a problem. Because Hurricane Helena made landfall on August 28th, and by September 3rd, FEMA had not even completed preliminary damage assessments. Anyone who has ever worked disaster response knows this is not a small detail. It's the entire system. You don't allocate billions before you know what you're allocating for. You assess, you verify, you project, then you release. But here, the money moved first. And Moskowitz made sure that detail didn't get lost in technical language. He cut through it. You authorized $2.7 billion before FEMA finished assessing the damage. Then he paused, not for effect, but for emphasis. That's not rapid response. That's something else. Stephen Miller tried to recover, leaning into the familiar script, talking about speed, about urgency, about ensuring resources reach affected communities. But Moskowitz didn't let him stay there. Because this wasn't a debate about intent, it was a confrontation with records. He introduced the next document, FEMA deployment logs. Every dollar tracked, every category listed: temporary housing, individual assistance, infrastructure repair, debris removal. 6 months after the hurricane, total FEMA spending tied to Helena response, $340 million. Not a projection, not an estimate, a recorded number. And suddenly, the gap wasn't theoretical anymore. It was mathematical. $2.7 billion authorized, $340 million spent, a discrepancy of $2.36 billion. And Moskowitz did something subtle but devastating. He slowed the math down as he said it, forcing the room to process the difference, not just hear it. Where is $2.36 billion? No rhetoric, no accusation, just subtraction. Then he pivoted. Wildfires. Because the authorization didn't just mention hurricanes, it explicitly included Western wildfire emergency operations. So he brought in another record. National Interagency Fire Center report. Total federal wildfire suppression costs for the entire season, $890 million. Across all states, all operations. Even if you assume every dollar came from that authorization, which it didn't, you still don't close the gap. You widen it. Because now, even under the most generous interpretation, over $1 billion remains unaccounted for. And this is where the structure of Miller's defense started to break down. Not because he said something wrong, but because he had nothing precise enough to counter what was already on the table. You can argue policy. You can reinterpret intent. But you cannot explain away a missing billion with generalities. Moskowitz understood that, and he pressed exactly where the system becomes fragile. Specificity. "Let me help you," he said, not as an offer, but as a warning. And then he pulled the authorization itself. Not a summary, not a paraphrase. The document. At the bottom, in a section most people in that room would never think to examine, sat a single line. Recipient entity. Emergency Response Solutions, LLC. A name designed to pass without question. Generic enough to sound legitimate. Professional enough to avoid scrutiny. But Moskowitz didn't stop at the name. He followed it. Corporate registration records. Date of incorporation, August 30th, 4 days before the authorization. Which means the entity that received $2.7 billion in disaster relief funding did not exist a week earlier. And that is the moment the hearing stopped being about mismanagement. Because mismanagement happens inside the system. This sat outside it. No physical office, no equipment, no personnel, no prior FEMA contracts, no operational footprint of any kind. Just a name on a form, and billions moving toward it. And at that point, the question Moskowitz asked wasn't just where the money went. It was how a system designed to track every dollar allowed that dollar to land in a place that had no history, no capacity, and no reason to be trusted with disaster relief in the first place. And this is where the story stops being about paperwork and starts becoming something far more difficult to look at. Because numbers don't suffer, but people do. Jared Moskowitz didn't need to invent outrage. He had lived the alternative. He had stood in neighborhoods where roofs were gone, where families slept under tarps, where the difference between funding approved and funding delivered wasn't a budget line. It was whether someone had water, power, or a place to sleep that night. So when he looked at that $2.7 billion gap, he wasn't seeing accounting irregularities. He was seeing everything that money was supposed to become. Generators that never arrived. Emergency shelters that were never built. Checks that never reached families who lost everything. And he made sure the room saw it too. Because while Stephen Miller sat at that table, surrounded by legal counsel, protected by procedure, there were still hurricane victims waiting on assistance months after impact. Still wildfire survivors rebuilding with whatever they could salvage. Still communities operating in the gap between promise and delivery. That is the moral fracture at the center of this moment. On one side, a system that claims precision, oversight, accountability down to the last dollar. On the other, a number so large it should have left fingerprints everywhere, and yet somehow didn't. And then Moskowitz did something that turned suspicion into a trail. He followed the money after it landed. 2 days after that, $2.7 billion was transferred. The receiving account didn't deploy resources. It didn't fund operations. It didn't mobilize a single response effort. It wired the money out. 4 transfers. $890 million to the Cayman Islands. $620 million to Switzerland. $775 million to Singapore. $415 million to the British Virgin Islands. Not scattered spending. Not phased allocation. Immediate extraction. And suddenly, the narrative that might have survived as bureaucratic confusion collapsed under something much harder to explain: intent. Because disaster relief money does not move offshore. It moves into communities. It moves into contracts tied to equipment, labor, logistics, recovery. It does not disappear into financial centers known for secrecy within 48 hours. And the room understood that. Not through outrage, but through recognition. The low, controlled shift in tone that happens when people realize they are no longer watching incompetence. They are watching a pattern. Moskowitz let that realization settle, and then he tightened the frame even further. Because the Inspector General report didn't stop at those 4 accounts. It followed the second layer. Within 1 week, those offshore accounts broke the money into smaller transfers. 23 separate recipients. Law firms, consulting groups, private equity funds, and 3 individuals whose names couldn't even be spoken publicly because they were already under active federal investigation. At this point, the question wasn't just where the money went. It was who it touched. And that's where the line between system failure and personal responsibility begins to blur, then disappears entirely. Because according to the same findings, 2 of those 23 recipients had direct connections to Stephen Miller's orbit. A former deputy who left government just weeks before the authorization. A contractor who had worked inside his policy team. Now the money wasn't just missing. It was circulating within a network that intersected with the very office that approved its release. And that is the moment where the hearing crossed a threshold it could not come back from. Because once money meant for disaster victims appears inside a chain of transactions connected to decision makers, the question changes. It's no longer what happened. It becomes who knew, and more importantly, who stayed silent. And that silence, those 167 seconds, became more than hesitation, more than strategy, more than legal caution. It became a statement. Because in a system built on testimony, where every answer is recorded, transcribed, dissected, and archived, refusing to answer is not neutral, it is a choice with weight. Jared Moskowitz understood that better than anyone in that room, and he didn't interrupt it. He measured it, second by second, letting the absence of explanation grow louder than any defense Stephen Miller could have offered. 10 seconds, a pause. 30 seconds, still nothing. 1 minute. The room no longer watching a hearing, but a collapse. Because every second that passed without an answer wasn't just time. It was pressure, building against a narrative that had already been cracked open by documents, numbers, and a money trail that refused to stay hidden. And when Moskowitz reached that final count, 167 seconds, 2 minutes, and 47 seconds, he didn't raise his voice. He closed the case in front of everyone watching. Not with emotion, with sequence. Authorization. Shell company formed days earlier. No operational capacity. Immediate offshore transfers. Secondary distribution to entities tied back to the same orbit. And a federal official, under oath, choosing silence when given every opportunity to explain it. That is not a missing detail. That is a pattern that completes itself. But here's where this stops being about Stephen Miller, or even about that room. Because $2.7 billion is not abstract. It is the difference between a family rebuilding or not. It is the difference between a community recovering or staying broken. It is the difference between trust and collapse in a system that asks people to believe that when disaster strikes, help will come. So ask yourself this. If money allocated for hurricane victims and wildfire survivors can be authorized, redirected, and vanish through a chain of entities that didn't exist weeks earlier, and the person responsible for that authorization can sit under oath and say nothing, what exactly is left of accountability? What does oversight mean if silence carries no immediate consequence? And what happens the next time disaster hits, when the same system asks the same people to trust it again? Because this was never just about numbers. It was about a test. A test of whether the system can still trace its own actions, whether power can still be questioned without protection, whether the people who control billions in public funds are still bound by the same expectation as everyone else. Answer the question. And for 167 seconds, that answer didn't come. So now it shifts to you. If you believe moments like this shouldn't disappear into the same silence that protected them, make sure this story doesn't stop here. Like this video so it reaches beyond this room. Comment with what you think really happened to that $2.7 billion. Share it with someone who still believes oversight always works the way it's supposed to. And subscribe, because the next piece of this, every entity, every connection that can be named, deserves to be seen, documented, and understood.